Is it done? Okay. Yeah. Okay, got it. Anything else? So, thanks for inviting me. This is a lot of fun. I have 3 degrees from U of O, so I call myself a 3-time duck, but I now work at Beaver University, and so that's really different. It's a different. So people call me platypus, but I'm not sure that's quite right. I still use my duck mouse pad, so I'm just saying I'm a loyalist. So regarding the truffle thing, interesting enough, when I was a director at Grand Ronde of Culture, I forget who it was. Somebody called me about naming the Oregon brown truffle, and they named it the Calipuy truffle. So it's actually got an actual official name called the Calipuy truffle. So yeah, so that was pretty fun. Little project we did there. So that got through the tribe really well. So good. Great. So lots of people here. It's good because I was actually double booked tonight. The other thing was go drinking with my friends at OSU. So I chose you guys instead. You should feel privileged. I could be drinking now. Probably have to stay in Corvallis at that point. All right, so I have a book out. I promised this years ago on my blog, and my book is out. It's been out about almost a year. It's not quite a year. I've done about 80 presentations. So, and I've done quite a bit in this area too. I think I've been more accepted in the Eugene area than anywhere else for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. And I'm actually working on other projects down here. So I should do more things in the next couple of years related to the area. I'm working with the McKenzie River Discovery Center that's developing up there. And I'm working with Lane County History Museum, and I'm working with the Springfield Museum as well. And they actually have an event tomorrow in Springfield called Illuminate at Wildish, and it starts around 6:30. And this year they're looking at native peoples of Springfield. So I call it illuminative or illuminative, but whatever. So so if you want to come, I think it's a public thing and anybody can come. I should be there as well. So they have a whole series of presentations if you want to. If you're not out truffle hunting, of course. All right, so let me just launch into this. We have about an hour to go. Takes me a while to get through this. All right, so let me see what the procedure is. Here is the book again. The cover is actually a design by a native person, Greg Robinson from the Chinook Nation. He's a carver. He does public art. He also has picked up this 2D art, the painting. He does a lot of really cool art like that. He's got an website where he sells his art online. You can get prints and things. He let me pick anything I wanted from his catalog. I chose this because it really showed the sort of rolling valley scene, which I thought was pretty kind of cool. And it works really well for the book. You know, it looked like I wanted to get some sort of image of maybe Calapuyans living in long houses in the valley. That's what I got. So that's great. And so it's actually a work of art. There you go. So the book lays out like this. Oh, incidentally, this presentation is in 2 parts. The first is about the book itself. Second part is further research I'm doing or working on figuring out how to do. So this part, so this is how the index lays out. For whatever reason, I chose, or somebody chose, or nobody really chose numbers for the chapters. And so if you tell me chapter 3, I don't know what that is. So, and maybe in the second edition, I may throw some numbers in there because that may be easier to look at. But I go through things very historically in the history of the tribes, mainly look at the Willamette Valley, peoples, mainly the Kalapuya, Molalla, and Clackamas people. If you've been to my blog site, and probably a number of you have been on there, you know that I deal with the Umpqua Valley, the Rogue River Valley, the coast as well, the Columbia River. But I concentrate in this book, at least, on the Calapuyans and Molalla people because because I had a lot of content for one thing on the blog, and I figured out that the blog actually articles became later on the first draft of the chapters. So I just mine my own content for for information, for context, for stories. And then I sort of jammed it all into the book and made a book out of it. So that kind of worked really well. So if you want to see the first draft or want to see more information about these same tribes or peoples that are related to them, I would suggest go to my blog site online called the Cortex Journal. It's freely available. There's over 500 essays there. So there's quite a bit of content. It will keep you busy for a couple of days. So, and then I look mainly in the book at the colonization, settlement era, trying to discern as best as possible. So what happened? I don't know. I don't think in my mind that the historians of the past did a really good job at that. They didn't really tell stories from Native perspective. They didn't include Native perspective. And they didn't include Black and Latino and women's perspectives at all either. But really, I'm really concerned about Native perspectives, about what happened to us, what happened to my family in the midst of all this history. And I didn't see that in most history books about Oregon. And I thought that was important, at least to me and people like me, and probably a lot of people that appreciate Native people maybe think it's important as well. And so this is kind of the new era of maybe history, where we have not just one perspective represented, but multiple perspectives, and we see things from different perspectives in the same stories. And I try and do that as much as possible. I don't try to deal much with what is out there from a settler perspective, because that's already written. I don't need to rewrite that again. It's been written numbers of times. And you have sometimes whole library alleys full of books like that. So I don't know that I need to rewrite that myself. So I really kind of concentrate on the Native perspective in much of the work, even though most of the content was not written by Native people at all. It's actually written by government agents and, settlers and explorers and those folks that were coming through the area. And occasionally they would collect something from a Native person. So as you know, you probably read some of these things like Lewis and Clark, like that. So, and then I also follow the tribes like into the process of treaty making, removal, and then into the reservation and what happens on the reservation. And that's not a fun story at all. But that was largely not looked at all by most historians. And so people just, for whatever reason, decide not to look at that context. So, and I do, and I wanted to know exactly what happened, how we were treated, why our populations declined, things like that. So let me move on here so I don't get too far ahead of myself. So I really want to tell stories from Native perspectives. I also I knew that there was a problem in Oregon and really probably across the United States and Canada, everywhere else, of having Native histories and culture talked about in our education systems. So so I was thinking ahead of time in terms of producing some sort of content that could be used in high school or college or just for the regular public, because I've been doing these presentations now for something like 20 years, not the exact same one, hopefully, but very much like it. And so, and I know that every sort of like group that I talk to, society, community or a classroom or whatever, they don't really know what I'm talking about until I start filling them in the details. They've never gotten Native history by and large in classes at all, unless they seek it out themselves or read books about it. And so that is a problem with every generation, not just the younger ones. So I know that this needs to be accessible to a wide cross section of our population, and I think that's important to say. And so I didn't write it with a heavily anthropological language. I could have. So I wrote it with a more common language, try to not keep a lot of the heavy anthropological effects out of the text. I am working on not really a follow-up, but a book that we've been working on for a number of years with Tom Connolly and Henry Zink. And it's going to be called The Calipuins of Western Oregon. And that book will have much more sort of academic content in it, pretty well referenced, pretty well reviewed, and then we're at about 80% right now in the book, getting articles and essays from a wide subsection of scholars that looked at Calipuins from various perspectives. So Anyway, so we're working on that now, and that will expand upon many of the stuff I talk about in here. I introduce sometimes in here. I also want to be very accurate with our histories. I think sometimes historians of the past kind of ignored the accuracy and kind of followed along with their predecessors, what they had written, sometimes copied what they'd written and multiple generations of that. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, as somewhat scientists, we need to go back, and I'm not really a historian, I'm more of an anthropologist. So as a scientist, I feel like I need to go back and check the original details, the primary documents, to make sure that what I write, it fits actually what happened in history, not just what some historians said in the 1930s. So that's what we should be doing all the time, because as we move forward in time, more and more resources are available in our archives, in our libraries, that we can access and then confirm details and then find new information about that same event that should be written into our histories. And that's just a process. As you probably know, history is not, it's kind of a continuous marathon. We're constantly working on it, gathering new information as we go through the years. Also, when I presented the manuscript to the press, and again, if you don't know, it's an independent press out of Portland, connected with PSU, and they have students that basically have taken a class and they do some editing or graphics work or whatever for various volumes they're a part of. And so I had probably like 30 or more people working on the book in a period of almost 2 years. So when I presented my manuscript to the press, they thought it was good for history, but they wanted more. They said it was, history is somewhat boring unless we really add more perspective to that, add more sort of personal content in there. And so I did. I have these sort of short sections in here, essays with my experience doing this research, what I got new understandings, finding new places on the landscape that maybe I'm the first of my generation to find in our history books, because there hasn't been a lot of people like me in the tribe, a lot of historian type people that have gone as deeply as I have into the histories and try to figure stuff out like I have. I think that's it's very meaningful to me to find exactly where the villages were of the Sandiam, where my people came from, between Scioto and Albany on Thomas Creek. So that's a very, very particular place in Oregon, if you know what that is. And so that's very meaningful, just as meaningful as somebody from Scotland figuring out there was a castle you came from. That's that kind of meaningful. So in many ways, this is really genealogy for me, not just history. All right, let's move forward. So, sorry, in part in the book, in doing these presentations for years, there's been I found a lot of people have stereotypes and misconceptions about Native peoples. One of these problems we have is things like, how people died off, why the populations declined so fast, what the disease was that came here. Bob Boyd pretty much proved that in his book, his pestilence book from 1999, that it was probably malaria that hit us pretty hard here, brought here by fur traders and passed on to our own Anopheles mosquitoes, who became the vector for that disease that passed through all the native populations who had no defense for it. So we died off. Californians died off at a point of about 97% of the population died, like pretty pandemic related in terms of their population, their culture. But people have come to me still and said, keep on saying to me, even though we've been talking about this for years and this book has been out for a very long time, Bob Boyd's book, about how there's been these smallpox blankets brought here. And I'm like, well, we don't find anything in our histories that say that actually happened here. There may be something 4 centuries ago on the East Coast. There was probably something with the Blackfeet area, but not here, not in Oregon, not Pacific Northwest, that we can find. So that a lot of that stuff is what we call urban legend. People sort of trying to fill in the blanks with information they don't really know what happened. So I try to address those things as best as possible, try to discourage people from not knowing really what happened to what actually happened. So I give a lot of really sort of deep information in the book. People say it's pretty dense. It is. And I admit that. And so maybe some people have decided to read it 2 or 3 times just to get all the details. I think it's important sometimes. Yeah, so that's one thing. All right, so I also go into a lot of environmental history, or some environmental histories. One of the things I discovered doing my research is this notion in the 1850s that the settlers began calling native people vagrants and thieves. And I was wondering, I was very curious as to why that began developing in the 1850s. And it hadn't really been as big of a thing in before that. Maybe there was less newspapers or whatever. People didn't have editorials back then, 1840s in Oregon. But I think what happened was there were a lot of changes that were brought to the valley by settlers. They brought a whole new philosophy of how to sort of envision the land here. Most of them were agriculturalists, farmers, and they wanted to put that nice, clean prairie into better use, and the better use is agriculture. And so we started to see earliest settlement began 1843 or so, and then the Oregon Trail developed 1844, and then by 1850s we had tens of thousands of people coming to Oregon on the Oregon Trail or by ship, and then letting off in places like Oregon City or Portland, or what became Portland later on, and then sort of filing into the valley and making land claims at Oregon City, and then settling on, at that point, 640 acres or a mile square parcel of land. So by 1852, most of the land in the valley was claimed by white people, even though there had not been yet a treaty with all the native people who technically would own the land under Aboriginal land claim, even under US law. And so that's a big problem. At that point, in the 1840s, a lot of native people had been devastated by disease. They were very much reduced population. They couldn't, if they wanted to, protect their land from settlement, from sort of the invaders coming in. And they learned to adapt to that new lifestyle. Many of them began hiring themselves on to farms, helping build fences, build barns, learning how to, do farming things. So they began being experienced in that. And many of them wanted to do that. They saw that as something interesting in the future they wanted to do, to sort of acquire wealth, just like a lot of settlers did. And yet by the 1850s, most of those farms were built. And so they no longer needed sort of regular labor from the native people. And, they didn't like native people walking across their land, taking cattle or horses occasionally. They didn't want them around. They were non-Christians. They called them savages. So they were not really desirable to have these people walking around, vagrants, and stealing food when they were starving, because all that agriculture, all that planting, putting cattle and horses into these fields was destroying native crops, which were actually food. And so, yeah, by the 1850s, they began starving. Native people began sort of not being able to put the food away. They had to for the wintertime to survive through the winter. And they began asking, in fact, Brownsville has great stories in the archives there of people native people coming up to the farms that they just worked in last season and asking for a handout of food because they're starving. And the farmers saying, no, we're not going to give our food away for free. We're not going to support you because you're a savage, you're a vagrant, and on your own land, by the way. And so, yeah, it seems funny, but it's actually, very serious back then. And so that was the really problem. So that became kind of what they call a settler colonialism problem, where settlers were colonizing the area, taking all the land, taking all the resources, and pushing the native people to the margins. And that problem, I point out many times in the book, continues in the present. We still see Most Native people don't have land. For 8 years, I was on the Oregon Heritage Commission. We were overseeing a project which recognized 100-year farms, century farms. And I realized when I was doing that, there are no Native people that can actually be a century farmer, because there are no Native people that I know of that have farms for 100 years. So that's kind of a point in my original point, of us being dispossessed and landless and pushed onto reservations. And so I go over those points in the book quite a bit. So that going back to that environmental problem is something I've gone into more and more recently. We'll talk about that in a minute, in my second part of the presentation. All right, so going on to the reservations, like I promised, people got to the reservation, and there's a lot of changes all at once within a few months, perhaps a few weeks for some people. So people didn't know where the food was when they got to the reservation. They didn't know the land. They didn't, some of them had not experienced that environment before because they come from somewhere else. If you're from the Rogue River Basin and you come to Grand Ronde, it's a wholly different environment, right? And then they were relieved of their weapons, so they couldn't go hunting. They didn't know where the fishing rivers were. The South Yamhill River is not that great for fishing in that area of the reservation, even today. And so, and then they were told they had to eat this, what we can now call commodity foods, beef and pork and whatever the government gave you to eat. And we have stories of people not knowing what to do with the pork because they never experienced a really fatty, smelly animal like that before, and they were throwing it out. And so a woman in Victoria Howard, who was from the Clackamas tribe in Oregon City, and she'd worked in the households there before they were moved to the reservation, she knew what to do with it. She showed them how to render the pork down, the fat off the pork, turn that into oil, and cook with that. And so that becomes the beginning is what we call fry bread, right? So that is the most unhealthy thing in the world, but people love it because it's all the fat content. And so people were they were adjusting to a whole new nutrition. They were in a new environment, a wholly different environment. They no longer could regularly access their native foods. And then the many people had not even generation 4 been through diseases that had wiped them out. And on the top of all that, some of these people, like the Rogue Rivers and some people in the Columbia, had been through conflicts and wars. Rogue River Indian War, the Cascades Massacre, these wars on the Columbia. So these things had destroyed whole villages. I mean, volunteer militia from Oregon had gone out and literally wiped out whole villages as retribution for any kind of attack by Native people. And we're talking men, women, and children. Sometimes the women and children were kidnapped and brought to a town, and all the men were wiped out. But these are near genocidal actions that people had experienced, and they were brought to the reservation and expected to live among 32 other tribes, and white people imposing a whole new cultural system upon them, and that had to be traumatic and stressful. So at that point, when I was realizing all this was going on the reservation, I thought there was a much bigger story here, and I spent a lot of time in that book in different ways, looking at different effects of government policy, looking at how the government seemed to not really know what it was doing. I mean, nowadays we kind of understand the government doesn't know anything about money and people, right? So that was happening back then too. And then back then, the federal government was in Washington, D.C., same thing, and they didn't understand what Oregon was about. Oregon is as big as much of the whole East Coast, right? So they didn't understand how far everything was from each other. And so the food budget that came out of the treaties was largely eaten up by what they call teamster costs of transporting the food from the Willamette Valley to the reservation. So that was never figured in, and there was no additional monies that came from anywhere for that food budget. So, and those things were sometimes irregular. The shipments of food are irregular. Sometimes they never arrived. money was irregular because that was a political process. Didn't matter what the treaty said. What is it? The House Representatives are the bank, right? And they have to vote on the spending bills, and they have to vote to allocate the money from the treaties into some spending bill every year. And if that is slow or doesn't happen, the money never gets to Oregon. And it doesn't come to Oregon in the first place. It actually goes to San Francisco, where the Wells Fargo had their bank. And then agents from Oregon had to go by steamer down to San Francisco to get the money to bring it back to Oregon. So that all takes weeks. In the meantime, people are on the reservation starving. So we see a lot of situations where Indian agents were literally working on credit. They were buying food from farmers and from stores, from merchants on credit. And then those credit notices would come up. There'd be a letter from a creditor back to the government saying, hey, Palmer charged all this money or all this food, and so you owe us this much money. So they'd have to go back and ask Palmer if that was true, and he had to certify it, and even though he was no longer an Indian agent or anything. So it was a big problem back in the day, and government didn't seem to really know what it was doing. Didn't train the agents really. Didn't really know what it was doing in terms of tribes in the area. So that's all rather interesting when you figure they're technically in charge of managing some 6,000 to 7,000 people in Oregon, Native people, and pushing them off their lands, putting them on reservations, and caring for them according to the treaties. Doesn't really make much sense, but that's what they were supposed to do. So many people on the reservations, when they realized it kind of sucked, they decided they had to find money somewhere, and so many people began leaving the reservations to find work. A lot of people go into the valley here. A lot of people from Grand Ronde go around Salem, Independence, Wheatland Ferry, Siletz, and maybe Klamath and Warm Springs. People would come into the Eugene, Springfield area, and they were hiring on for hop farms like the CV farm here and other farms. But that was pretty consistent throughout the valley. We see Warm Springs people coming to Springfield, to Sweet Home, to Portland area. We see Siletz people in this area over by Corvallis and maybe Albany, things like that. It's because Native people were like the only force of labor that you could pay really super cheap, and were poor, and you could basically put them up under a tent on your property, and they'd work for their money for a couple of weeks, and they'd leave. There wasn't a lot of populations of poor people that wanted to labor that hard in the fields in Oregon. Blacks were not allowed in, as you probably know, and there weren't a lot of Latinos here at the time. There wasn't a lot of Latinos until maybe the 1930s, when the Bracero Act was passed. And there were eventually becoming poor whites in the area, but it was Native people. And so Native people from the reservations were the first indigenous migrant labor force that were moving around in the valleys in the summertime, going from crop to crop when they're ready, and then coming back to the reservation at the end of the summer, and then maybe harvesting their hay they had planted earlier. So that became something that went on for 100 years. By the 1950s, that's collapsing. Bracero Act brought in Latinos from like Mexico and other places, and those people were working for even less. Not being Americans, they could be treated worse too. So that took a lot of like jobs away from Native peoples. And then we started to see, I've been doing a little work on this recently. They started to see the Native people being hired by like Kaiser shipyards in Portland. And there were literally a lot of Native people from all the reservations in the area, from Washington and Oregon, going to the Kaiser shipyards, getting jobs, building these Liberty ships since the mid-1930s into the 40s until the war was won. So we see them get a lot of experience through that. But going on to the reservation was not a great idea. A lot of people were leaving because it was not a great place to live. And if you didn't want to just leave altogether, you would just leave for a season, come back, and live through the winter there instead. So There were a few chiefs, and I was able to luckily find some statements by chiefs, leaders in the tribe about what was happening on the reservation. This is one where I think it's actually, I'm not sure who this is. I should have wrote down who this was. I should have put the one in here from San Am. It's awesome, but this one's good too. So this is a meeting in Salem at the First Methodist Church, and it had Indian agents there, and it had missionaries there from the Methodists, and they were lecturing to the Native people, and all of the leaders and all the tribes in Oregon were there, and they were lecturing to them about them needing to access white doctors, go to white doctors, them needing to send their kids to school, and stopping sort of gambling and drinking, because clearly the Methodists didn't like it, and so they wanted them to sort of live more moral habits, which, the chiefs point out that was kind of odd. So the chiefs of the reservation pushed back against Bruneau's words, citing they had been taught to drink by whites, and everyone seemed to be gambling and drinking anyway, so why stop? They wanted equal treatment. They explained how poor everything was on the reservation, that they had no resources, and the promises of land sales and treaty making had not worked. They were still poor while the whites got rich. They revealed that the white Indian agents were not following the laws, and the United States was not appropriately following their agreements in the treaties of giving allotments and funding for the needs of the reservation. So they were basically telling them what was happening, as best they could. And there's a follow-up statement from Chief Lopez Nuez Neposank in terms of the chiefs all signed onto a petition. They sent to President Ulysses S. Grant, who had just promised in around was 1868 or so, when he was inaugurated, that Native people would have a path to citizenship if they civilized. They said, I have now been on this reservation 16 years, and during that time, I have seen poor white men come here as officers of and stay a few years and go away rich, while I and all my people have always been growing poorer. We had first had a great deal of money, and we came in agreement with the terms of our treaty, but people have never got much benefit from that money. Our superintendents and agents have got all of it, while I have seen my people die for the want of food, just as our horses die in the winter when they have nothing to eat. The men you have sent here for officers have not only stolen our money, but have violated our women and scattered diseases among us, which have reduced our numbers from thousands to hundreds. So, yeah, Neposank was chief of the Marys River tribe. These people were very sort of outgoing, and they were warriors in their own right on the reservation there, so even though they may get some retribution later. But what they were saying in this 1872 is they had no land, and they had been promised land in the treaties. The president was supposed to allocate land to them according to the treaties. That had never happened. So right after this, they were able to get 100 acres of land. I don't know if the petition was working. I think things are already headed that direction. There's a whole set of allotments called the Thompson allotments at Grand Ronde, where they did a survey of the reservation that gave like each family 100 acres to manage. And if you compare that to the 640 that settlers got, you see it's kind of a pittance at that point. And the problem is at our reservation at Grand Ronde, most of the soil is clay. So you're not really growing much food there, or not for very long, maybe a couple of years, then it kind of goes, there's no nutrients and it makes less food. And so what they're growing mainly is then later on hay. They do get pretty good at it. So by the 1880s, we see reports from the Indian Affairs that says, well, they are fully managing their own affairs at the reservation. They are, we've now repaired their grist and sawmill, and they're running it themselves. They are running 12-horse teams, and they're experts at this, and they're going out and hiring their services out to neighbors off the reservation. And so it's like everybody at the reservation began to work together as a community. And if some families didn't know how to farm, they would all get together and farm all their land together, and then harvest all land together, so they had collectively several thousand acres they could farm that way. And so they were able to survive like that. So it wasn't until 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, and they got upwards of 240 acres, or 240, 260 acres. That's still a little more than twice. But most of the problem was that most of that acreage was not conjoined. It was like separate fields here and there. Because I believe, I think it's true that they didn't actually move their houses from the first allotment to the second allotment. It would be almost impossible to move your house at that point. So what they had to do is split up the rest of the reservation. And so people got sometimes 4 different allotment areas. And eventually that was all sold off, but that's how it worked. But so the idea of civilization, I didn't really address that very much. I do it a little bit in the book. The idea of civilization is quite interesting to me. It doesn't, I think it means it's a lot worse than you think it is. Civilization seems like a good thing to expect people to be like, but the civilization in the 19th century meant you had to become Christian, you had to do something worthwhile in society, some sort of gainful employment like farming in society, and you had to be living in the same style as white people. So really, they were forcing people to throw off their culture and become white people. At the same time, it wasn't until 1924 that the Native American Citizenship Act was passed, and so it didn't happen in Grant's lifetime. So, and probably the lifetime of anybody that was trying to do better on the reservation. So it took a while because the Native people were not really trusted or wanted in American society until at least the 1920s. So a lot of problems there, a lot of delays. And so that's kind of, there's much more in the book. I didn't do every detail, so you'd have some reason to buy the book. So in many ways, I'm rewriting or fixing history, trying to write a Native perspective for the book itself. I'm not going to go over all this stuff. I'll go on to my second part, which maybe you're much more interested in, actually. So what I'm doing now is continuing on with that sort of environmental history pieces, trying to figure out like what parts of the natural landscape today has clues or information about the tribes themselves. So I'm mainly an anthropologist. I really want to understand the culture of the tribes, the Kalapuas, especially my people. The whole valley was their domain. All the way into the Umpqua Valley was their domain. But it's been radically changed. And you have to understand the changes that have happened to the valley in the last 180 years to understand how we get back to the point of rebuilding or reconstructing that valley the way it was before. And I bring this up because a lot of folks want to restore landscapes. They want to restore maybe oak savannas, do restoration work. There's a lot of people that want and like to do that kind of work. And there's actually organizations that are doing that today. But most of them are not working from a place where they know what it was like before. There's a lot of assumptions about what it was like before, but I haven't seen a lot of environmental historians out there writing up the history of the valley in the 1840s before it was all radically changed. So that's kind of what I'm starting to do. Let's see these changes. So first off, this is a view from Peterson Butte. And you can see this is pretty much what our valley looks like. In my lifetime, I've only really seen these sort of dry fields, this dry, arid landscape. This is the whole valley is this way too, except for maybe West Eugene wetlands is about the only difference. All the rest of it, you go down I-5, the sort of really fast straight I-5 now. It's all ag fields, and you almost never see standing water anywhere. And that didn't really gel with a lot of what I was finding in our older history when I can't find them. And I figured out that what was happening in our lifetimes and before our lifetimes, that there's a lot of drain tiling and ditching that were going on. And these are all technologies and methods that were developed, began developing centuries ago, but really were developed in the last 100 years. Mainly, I think, at Oregon Agricultural College, where they had an experimental station they were working on things like developing drain tiling, which is now a regular practice. If you don't know what that is, that literally means they make tiles, like ceramic tiles that have a little runnel in them, and they put those together, and that makes a big long underground stream. And they put it underground about 1.5 feet, and they're about 18 inches apart. And they run those through all the fields. They bury them in all the fields. And so what that does is allows the groundwater to trickle down into those runnels. They go all the way down to the local ditches and streams, and they get out of there fast. So it's a constant way to drain your land. Because the problem in Oregon we have is there's a lot of rain, and that rain causes lots of wetness and wetlands, not something that farmers like. Okay, they want to control that water. They want to make it more arid. They don't want their crops to drown out if they have too much water. So that's been a big problem in Oregon for a long time, but we figured out how to fix all that, or according to this new philosophy of agriculture. So this is what maybe a time like now where there's lots of rain, the land should look like. This is all 1930s before they put in the dams on the Santiam River. This is happening more like this because we've completely controlled the water through series of dams on most of the major rivers, all around the periphery of the valley. And then we put in lots of things like ditching and drain tiling to run that water out to the Willamette faster, and then out to the ocean faster than ever before. I first came upon maybe the subject when I was doing a little bit of history work on Lake Labiche. It's a lake complex north of Salem. Chemau Indian School is somewhere down here today. So this is 1850s era GLO map. GLO is this survey series they did in Oregon, and there's notes attached to every map for sometimes years. So I didn't have a map of Lake Labiche. I didn't know what it looked like. It's kind of hinted at it on several maps, but it didn't have an actual map. The GLO maps do have that. We have this nice Lake Labiche, and then we have all these areas right here, which I've colored in to look, and those are what I call the swaling or ponding action that happens with high moisture in the valley, rainfall with snow melt, things like that. So at this time of the year, this is what Lake Labiche would look like, where there would have been a major lake in the middle and all this ponding on the outside. The problem is, and there were lots of farmers in the 1880s, 1890s that wanted to expand their properties. They originally had claimed things like, these properties here. You notice that most of them are outside of this drain, this wet spot right here. They're all outside of that because once you put your crops into the wet area, the swaly area, and it gets too wet, the crops drown. So by the 1880s, 1890s, they want to make use of all their land. Like if they own this, they want to make use of all of it. So how do you do that? So they're working on ways of ditching and draining off their land at that point. They didn't have the money to do it. So what they did is they attracted in around 1915 or so, they attracted these two land speculators from California, the Hayes brothers, to buy 1,000 acres at Lake Labiche at $1 an acre. And the only way you can get that low is because this land was all called worthless land. You couldn't farm it. This is all number one ag land. This is all worthless land. I don't know what number that is, 10 or something. I don't know. Anyway, so they bought 1,000 acres inside the lake and around it at $1 an acre. They then spent $150,000 of their own money digging a ditch all the way to the Willamette over here, a 6-mile trench with what they call a ditch witch, and we have pictures of that. So by 1918, they were able to fully drain that lake so that it was mostly dry in the summertime. It took couple more decades for them to figure it all out. They put a pumping station and another dam in there. So by the early 1960s, they had it all completely dried for farming in the summertime. So once this was all dried up and usable by farmers, this nice peat soil was like number one soil you want. It never kind of runs out of nutrients. They probably made a mint on that. I haven't seen the figures yet of how much they sold the land for. They probably sold off quite a bit of it to make a lot of money on that from their original investment. But there's a whole subdivision like right down here in Salem called Hayesville. And I can only guess that they used that money there that they made to buy a huge subdivision down here. And they made a mint off that too, because that became the Jan Ray Gardens and, Chemeketa Community College, all that stuff is right there. So that was pretty interesting. And the descriptions here, and the reason why I was really interested in his, I suspected that this is a major resource for the Kalapuya tribes. We had the Chemawa village up this way. We had the Chemeketa village down here in Salem. We had the Malalas way over there on the east side of the valley, and they all would come here and collect food like wapato or camas or hunt or fish in this area. And so this was what had to have been a major resource. The only good record we have is about wapato collection by the Malala people. And they had their own name for the lake at that point. So it was a major resource. So that was all interesting. The reason how it came to be that that the state allowed this to happen is because nobody really wanted it to remain there. It didn't fit their philosophy of making use of the land, of making it more useful land. So nobody raised a stink, and they were able to destroy the lake by doing that. All these farmers benefited by that. So what they did is, so here I'll show you some pictures of that area. This is what it looks like today, or like not right today, a couple of years ago today. And this nice black soil, all peat soil, and they mainly grow walla wallas there, but they've been bringing in hazelnuts and blueberries too. And then this last winter, there was lots of rain. I tried to get like an image of what it may have looked like as a lake. And we have this area on this one man's property, somebody I've been working with on his property that looked like lake structure with waterfowl here, which would may have originally looked like in the past. I've been working with this farmer now for a couple of years, because after I wrote the first blog post about draining Lake Labiche on the blog site, he contacted me the summer after that and said, hey, you talk about wapato, not really knowing if there's wapato in the lake. Well, I have something for you to see. So here's what we saw. He's had 4 patches of this wapato on his property, and he didn't plant it. It came back, and we don't know how. I think there was some sort of a seed bank in the soil, allowed to come back. He thinks that maybe coming from birds. I don't know. Could be either way. Could be both. I don't know. So, but we've gone back. We've gone back now the last couple of years, and this is expanding. It's now almost after that lake that developed this last winter. I think it moved a lot of seeds around, and so the wapato is coming up everywhere. So I think in 5 years we're going to see the whole lake bed covered with wapato again, like it probably should be. So that's pretty interesting. We're all interested in that. I got the Grand Ronde tribe involved. We want to give them help. Perhaps at some point transfer to the tribe for a conservation property. But he used to be an onion farmer. He turned the whole thing into conservation 20 years ago. So that's something you could do. So this is the wapato when it's being harvested this last year. You get small bulbs. I don't think it's an ideal environment yet. There's enough water yet, but they all are coming up, and in 2 or 3 years, they're going to need large size. That's going to be great. This wapato looks kind of what you call fallow at this point. It's dying off, but it's not really dying. It's going. The energy of the plant is going into the bulb, and the whole bulbs then expand in the fall. So right this time of the year is the best time to go out there and start harvesting it, because the bulbs are larger and more nutritious. So that's great. And we're learning more about that stuff. So one of those Hayes brothers took his winnings and went to Wapato Lake. He and another farmer invested in 800 acres here, same deal, $1,000 or $1 an acre. And then they built another trench over a period of several decades, because it took longer, to the Tualatin River. This lake we have much more information about. Henry Zink has done a great job mining records for the Tualatin. He's got at the Botany of Tualatin book out there. But we have treaty records that suggest the Tualatin people wanted this lake as their reservation in 1851. They never got it because that treaty was never ratified. That this was a major spot that the Wapato was a major spot where they could gather it. And the right time of the year, everybody, all the Tualatin had a right to come there and gather Wapato. His or Chief Kayakatz's village, principal chief, was about right here. He defended that pretty successfully in the circuit court in Hillsborough in the 1840s and won the case. He got his land back. So we have a lot more information about that. We also have really good descriptions of what the lake was like in the late 1800s, early 20th century. There was tons of Wapato there. It attracted tens of thousands of canvasback ducks, perhaps the original duck from University of Oregon, right? So that was pretty interesting. There was enough ducks and geese that came to this lake that it attracted the migration of sportsmen from Portland to come to the lake every weekend to shoot the ducks in the lake. They would put duck blinds around the lake, shooting ducks in the lake, and then apparently they were too lazy to go get their own ducks, and so they would sit there rotting for the next week. And farmers were kind of upset about that. But the farmers were not too upset because they didn't stop it. And they wanted this land gone anyway. So they just let the destruction happen. This eventually was turned into dry land with lots of sort of moisture control in this valley. I found out through the geolo maps that the whole swaley area went down into the mountains here. Pretty interesting. So it's much bigger than just the lake itself. Yeah, so by 1935, they were able to fully drain this lake out. And there's more to be said. Like right now, from the 1980s to the present, farmers have sort of given it up. There's just too much water in that valley around Gaston, and they don't want to spend any more money on that. It's a lot of effort and time every year to spend money sort of fixing that water drainage. And so they all decided by the 1980s to begin selling it back to the government. The federal government now has created a new wildlife preserve here called the Wapato Lake Wildlife Preserve or National Wildlife Preserve that's being run out of Tualatin National Wildlife Preserve. And they've now have open with trails, and the Grandon tribe is going in and replanting Wapato back in the lake. So it may take 10 years or more to bring it back, but they're working on it. So anyway, really interesting stuff. And all this information about how much water really kind of attracted my interest because I was doing other research on other things, as you probably know from my blog, about wetlands and Camas. That was my big deal. I'm like, what is wetlands related to Camas? How is that a big deal? And so I began looking at other geolo maps around Rickreall. They have this giant Camas prairie above Rickreall, which is about right here. Basket Slough is right over there. So that's interesting. It was big. And then these other two maps of the valley, which I got off the geolo maps again. So here's Lake Labiche. And then there's a lake right here, two lakes that were kind of a complex around Mount Angel. I wrote Poison Lake. It said that. I think it's actually Poisson because, those surveyors are probably not good spellers, but it's probably like Fish Lake. So, and then we have the Miry Swamper Slough up by Woodburn. So that's the Center Valley, Center North Valley. Over in the Tualatin Valley, we have these giant swamps that were coming out of the Coast Range. One of them, which is still there, the Killen Wetlands. You go by it if you drive the highway there. This is probably now all ag fields that have ditching and drain tiling put in. I'll bet you this is mostly dry now. Because the Killen Wetlands is still there, and I've not seen this kind of a wetland structure in that valley. So there's that. It gets more. So around Corvallis, there's this really great one map that shows Marysville, that's old name for Corvallis, and all this blue area, which is called a wet prairie. We see the wet prairie with it. Same map. Wet prairie. And there's all these blue areas, I assume, are then wet prairie. So that looks like this, and I didn't mark it up there, but I assume it's all the same. All this is wet prairie. And we know this area grows really good camas everywhere in all the fields. So these are probably the same wet camas prairies as the other survey map that was probably done by a different surveyor who labeled things differently. So that's pretty interesting. That's a pretty significant piece of the valley there. And then we go to south of Eugene, Springfield. I-5 roughly is right here. And what the sign on the highway says Camas Whale, right? Right there. Right below what's it called? Crestwell. So yeah, that's a giant Camas whale. And we have ethnography about that, where people, William Henry, saw them, Native people, gathering camas in that prairie. So that's a significant part of the valley. And then I have older notes. I went back even further to the U.S. exploring notes from Charles Wilkes and Company. Wilkes actually didn't come south of Salem, Chemeketa. He actually went north on the Columbia. But the Southern expedition had scientists like Henry Eld and George Emmons. Their journals I got a hold of and began reading as best I could. And it looks like Wilkes never saw these journals, or he should have written a little more into his journals that he published, because they're super detailed. And they talked initially about, I saw this thing about this giant lake, probably a swale, 80 feet in width and 3/4 of a mile in length and about a foot deep. And they call it Lake Lamali, which I believe translates, I think Zink worked with me on the translation. It means like wetland area. So may have looked something like this, but much bigger. That's pretty interesting. That's around Long Tom, kind of the end of the Long Tom, that they had to sort of navigate around. And I've been doing other research, looking at the farm field at Minto Brown Park. And this is juncus, a native plant Native people use here for making baskets. And there's your camas in the middle, and there's lots of camas around. And so that year, 2022, there was a lot of rainstorms in May. And the day after a rainstorm, that appeared. That's your swale. That's the original traditional landscape that should be happening. The original environment should be happening in the valley everywhere after a rainstorm. And that would probably happen everywhere in all those GLO maps, all those places and others in the whole valley. That's what we should be like. Minto, as you probably know, was an early farmer, brought in merino sheep into the valley. The first merino sheep here was one on the first board for the Oregon State Fair. And this is what his farm was like right here. And he existed before there was drain tiling and ditching, so he didn't put that in. So yeah, so this is what we should look like. It should be like, and a day later, it's gone. So that's, it was big enough that there was a big fish in there, and he was like swimming around, like almost getting caught on the edges. So, and I have pictures of that too. And then so I was initially looking for in the notes from the Wilkes expedition from Emmons and Dana and Eld for fire, and there's lots of fire evidence in there. So we've been a lot talking about cultural fire in there, bringing that back. I know it's been a big thing in the Eugene area. And we see some behavior of fire that interlaces with the behavior of sort of wet areas. And so a day or two before this August 11th, 1841, there had been a rainstorm. And so what happens then when the Californians are setting fire in August and September in the valley to the prairies, they're burning the prairies, and it doesn't burn into the green patches of woods, which are probably like moisture sinks, and they're basically creating this barrier so the fire doesn't go beyond that stream. It's not, they're doing it on a yearly basis, so it's not a catastrophic fire. It's actually just what they call a cool burn fire that only burns one area, and they can control it because they're in a time in Oregon with lots of moisture. And before maybe 20 years ago, when I was a kid growing up in Oregon, I thought could rain any day. And it's been much different in the last 20 years. But the fire evidence was pretty interesting for these journals. I loved reading about it because they always talked about the whole prairie was burnt, and they were camped out on the prairie, on this burnt prairie with horses. But the horses every evening would take off because they don't have any food because it's all burnt. So then they have to send scouts out after the horses. And they say almost every time it takes a day or half a day for them to find the horses. In the meantime, this expedition is walking south. So that's why it takes so long to get through the valley. They're not actually able to use their horses. And that's another symptom or characteristic of that fire, right? Pretty interesting. It's kind of a funny story, but it's pretty interesting too. So this gets to a lot of stuff like what is the behavior of fire around water? Our valley is unique for really having a lot of moisture here. We have really good soils. We have really good rainfall. We have really good sun. It grows plants like crazy. If you don't manage the fence lines or whatever, that becomes a bramble and a mess. And so management for the Calapooians was burning it. We have stopped doing that somewhat in Oregon because of the smoke effect. But people are now trying to bring it back in a cultural way, saying it's going to be better for the environment for restoration projects and things. But what about the moisture piece? I think we need to bring back that moisture piece too. It's not just fire that's going to restore our environment and restore native plants. It's got to be the moisture too. There's something important about the moisture in this valley. The plants and animals are adapted to it. And so we need to figure out what the equation is between fire and water in this valley. We want to do any kind of real good restoration work. And I think that's important to say. And actually, I've been working on understanding what that means to Calapooia culture. I painted him not just on a prairie, but in a wetland prairie here. But yeah, so what does it mean when the Calapooians are not just living on the prairie, harvesting from the prairie, but they're actually harvesting or living on a wetland prairie and harvesting a wetland prairie? That's a wholly different culture, so to speak. And I think there are some adaptations. I think that maybe in part the Calapooia mounds are an adaptation to wetlands. They are mostly found alongside these river systems like the Long Tom, the Calapooia River, on the Tualatin River. There's 3 different areas they existed in. And in places where you'd find mostly like camas fields. So how would it be? I was thinking, how would it be to sort of be out there harvesting camas in the middle of a rainstorm? Well, I think the mounds could be a way to sort of camp above the rainstorm because they're not that high, right? They're not like pyramids. They're not really that high. They're only about 5 feet above, sometimes 10 feet above the prairie. So if we then have our camp on top of that low mound, which is kind of wide, you could easily be living dry on top of a wet field. That's an adaptation, or one of the adaptations for them. I mean, other ways they were used for burials as well, but I think the first adaptation would be sort of to be above the water in when you're harvesting camas. The other thing is, I wonder about the territorial highways because they're really based on original native trails, Indian trails. They are now 99 east and west, right? They're not down the center of the valley where I-5 is today, but where do they go? They're up on the foothills, on the hills above where you're going to find a lot of wetland environment. So they're walking then north and south in the valley, fairly dry. And that's an adaptation. Native people would constantly do that, walk on mountain peaks as well, because it's a lot easier than going uphill and downhill all the time like we do today. But they didn't have cars and stuff, so they wanted to be more efficient in their walking, and so they didn't want to walk through water like really nobody really wants to. And then, unless you're a kid, right? And then so I think they did that. So the various adaptations. I think there's some understandings in how the water's been draining off that may deal with like fish populations. what does it mean to be constantly draining your land, like all the land, of groundwater all the time? How does that deal with like river health, with fish health, with plant health, with animal health? I think there's some stuff to be done there. Yeah, so those are the kind of things I'm working on right now. Not really knowing where that's going to take me, but really interested in those questions. You know, what would it mean to bring water back to this environment, to stop making it an enemy of this environment, but actually make it a friend as part of us. You know, I know there's reports in the United Nations today that say that we need to save 1/3 of our environments for native animals and plants. And right now, this valley is at 1%. So we're a little bit far behind that 8 ball. So I think I'll end it there, and maybe questions or whatever.
So, questions from the Zoom audience, you can put those in the chat and we'll get to those. Questions from the live audience. I'll take the question and repeat it so that the Zoom audience can understand what's being said, and then David will answer it. Did he?
Yeah. I think it is too. I think it's
Let me repeat.
right, okay.
So we can get it to the Zoom crowd. So the point was, often when we burn now without water in the equation, those just return to the invasive plants that we wanted to get rid of in the first place. But perhaps if we worse, and so perhaps what we need to do is build water, as David mentioned in his talk, back into that equation of burning. Did I get that?
I think that's true. I think that I mean, I haven't done a ton of projects myself, but I've been involved in some projects, and I think that native plants in this valley, from this valley, are probably adapted more to a wetland environment more times of the year than other non-native plants. And so if we do that, we would be stressing out the non-natives, and it would hopefully benefit the natives. Absolutely, sure.
Another question? Way in the back. As long as I can handle it.
You know, like they were using food cactus, and the second part was I'm learning at school at a name that primarily was oak abandoned around here. You also find that pretty safe.
So the question was, were food caches being used in the mounds or on the mounds? And also, were there caches being used in the oak savanna habitats as well?
I have not heard that food caches were being placed inside mounds at all. It could be. I mean, the problem is that, you know, originally I think on the Calapee River there was 160 odd mounds found. I think there's 4 left. So I don't know if we have a big data set to follow. I mean, they were all destroyed by farmers and stuff, and so I don't know if we have a big data set for that. But that could be a problem. I know there were other mounds in other places that haven't been really looked at very closely, like on the Long Tom and on the Tualatin, and I haven't looked at the original data to figure that stuff out. Maybe somebody like Tom Connolly can maybe answer that question better. And the other question was about from the descriptions, like the geolinops I have read, I think there was oak savanna here, but I think it was a mixed forest. We see a lot of ponderosas in the valley. We see different, you know, pines and everything in the valley, and we also see oak trees. And so I think it was a little more mixed than just an oak savanna. I think if we just assume that monocropped kind of environment, then that's a problem. Ponderosas are pretty well adapted to fire. They've got a hugely thick, several sets of bark, and so I think they survive pretty well in the valley too. Yeah.
Did I mention something?
Bill,
When you read through those geo survey notes, do they include mention of the mounds, or do they leave that out? Or were they deliberately leaving out native influence when they came across?
Pretty much.
so the question was, when you read those historical accounts, did they actually remove mention of the mounds and perhaps other native influence?
Yeah, I haven't read all the notes, and maybe reading more deeply into the notes around the Calipari I'd find more information about that. They may not be written in the way we think they are. And so we have to sort of figure out what their code is for that. But I don't see a lot of native information at all in GLO notes. I have found a few things like Chief Halo's original village on the Rao River, what we call Halito's village, is noted on one GLO map and written about also in a couple different places in the notes. That's one of the few instances where they did write that in because it still existed, and I don't find much of that otherwise. I mean, I think maybe probably the Clackamas village there at what's now Clackamas, Oregon. I think there's some notes on that. But the problem is that those villages were very far and few between, very far. There were not that many. So, yeah.
First of all, one person is asking about malaria. Why does that not seem to be present now?
You want to repeat that, or I'm getting used to your pattern here.
It's on the Zoom chat.
Okay.
You can let her rip.
All right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there have been sort of theories recently about how there may not have been malaria here. It's not a good environment for it. The problem is, I think it was a good environment. We had lots of water here, which is not being considered. And sort of they need to reconstruct what that environment looked like before they say there's not an environment here for that. And we did have the same kind of mosquitoes, what's called the Anopheles mosquito, which is the vector for malaria. We just didn't have originally malaria here. So that was brought here in the bodies of probably fur traders in the 1830s, probably 1828 or so. And that was passed on to our Anopheles mosquitoes here, who passed it on in the next couple of years to native population. There are records, and I did find this couple of years ago on, maybe more like 6-7 years ago on doing a search on Google Books, of all places. If you do a search for mosquitoes or malaria in Oregon, you come up with these state reports, and they're actually treating the waters in the valley against mosquitoes because of the malaria in Oregon. So into the 1950s.
Here's another question because somebody wants to know, and I'm not sure what they're referring to here, but maybe you'll understand. It says, did animals die in the cold fires? What are they talking about?
Did animals
The cold
die?
fire.
Oh, in the cold
The cold
burns.
burning? Yeah. I would probably guarantee some did, but the majority of animals sort of figured that stuff out. And I think, again, thinking about like adding water into that picture, not just fire, I'll bet you the water had a mediating influence. So it actually more animals would have survived through that because of the water. They would have gone to they would have learned at some point, those smart ones would have gone to these areas around the rivers and been saved. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another person wants to know, have you been in contact with the Nature Conservancy work on history of Willamette Valley? That may be a resource. I think they're recommending to the Nature Conservancy.
I haven't. I've had a lot of advice. I've gone to Iverson's work, and I need to do more with kind of bringing that all that advice together into something else. I started last summer collecting some more environmental history type information from the Lane County Archives. And it's a big piece of, or a part of my report that I put out, and for the Whitaker neighborhood. And so, so there's really great information in there about how the whole of this area right here was all wetland area, that the downtown Springfield is all wetland area. That, yeah, so all that stuff was really interesting. And I think I have a lot, I've been collecting a lot more of that. And so I think we have almost enough to do some sort of environmental, sort of almost, it would be a native history of the South Valley, but maybe had an environmental history piece in there as well that talks about that. I haven't really reached out to try to find anybody to sort of collaborate with yet. In all my talks, people like talk to me about, you know, one guy a couple days ago talked about how there's a whole GLO map project online I can get access to. And then they've got all the notes in there too, which are probably all now transcribed. And so I'd like to go on there at some point when I have some time and actually go on there and look at it and stuff. Yeah.
Was there something in there about beavers?
There was something about this, yeah.
Yeah.
A comment from David Wagner: rehabilitation environmental work has been a great inter-organizational effort. They have a lot of.
He just answered that. I'm gonna jump in. He just,
Environmental. I don't, David, I'm not sure what you're saying. David Wagner. It does say would beavers be a good start for recreating wetlands since they.
Yeah.
Down.
I mean, that's a great question. I've had that question a couple times from people. I kind of think that water has been problematized. It's been made an enemy just like fire. And so we see that in the whole, what's called the Willamette Valley project that began like 1930s or so, putting in all the dams in the valley. And then a piece of the Willamette Valley project budget was for the ditching and draining of the valley for farmers, because they wanted to make the Willamette Valley, and they did, made the whole Willamette Valley into a mecca for farming. And so that was built on this notion that water is a problem in the valley. So until we reverse that and make it that water is a good thing in the valley, I don't think beavers are going to be accepted. We need to allow water to remain for beavers to have something to work with, you know, really. Seriously. And I don't know if they're exclusive either. There could be areas like the Lucky Mute where we can do that. Absolutely, because there's not much water management up there. It still floods. There's lots of water there. I don't know if every single watershed is going to deal with that.
Go ahead. So the question is, what would be the population of humans, I assume you're talking about, that could actually be sustained by the resources in the Willamette Valley?
I don't know if that probably has happened. The notion of carrying capacity. I don't really access that stuff because the Native people disappeared pretty early, well before scientists even got here. Our estimates for the population of Californians was around 16,000 people. And there was maybe another couple, or maybe 1,000 Walala people, and then there was some Clackamas, maybe 1,000 Clackamas people in the valley. So that's where we're at in terms of a population. I don't know if it's worth it to actually do an estimate of how many people could have been here or would have been here. Yeah, I don't know, but I haven't done that work. You know. With beaver, like OSU or I don't know. I think a lot of people do like them. Or you want to say it again? Sorry.
No, I mean, we're back to beaver.
Okay. What's the situation with beaver? So I don't know exactly. I think they are allowed to come back, and people are basically leaving them alone. I don't know if I don't see any reintroduction projects right now that is allowing them to come back naturally. I mean, I've been in some places where we see sign of them, you know, basically beaver shit, but yeah. Yeah, right, and I would guarantee probably timber companies would do that on timberlands, right? Yeah.
So there's a distinction there between mountain beaver and beaver.
You're talking about boomers?
Boomers are. Mhm. Yeah.
I haven't really followed that issue yet. I think, again, I guess my focus is on seeing if people have an appetite for bringing water back and how we could do that. Clearly, ag in Oregon is huge. I don't know if we're going to be able to turn the valley back into a native landscape. But again, like I said, there are areas like the Lucky Mute where we probably could do a lot because the area doesn't have a dam really, not really well managed until floods. So we could probably do a lot with bringing some of that land into public trust and then bringing back a native landscape, letting beavers come back, stuff like that.
So let's do one more question and let David off the hook.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is work being done on beaver restoration. We had a talk some time ago about
Oregon.
beaver restoration around the Coast Range, which hadn't been all that successful, as I recall. So let's give David another round of applause.